We're now during the revolt. What do we know happened at Masada during the revolt, but before the mass suicide?
Right. So what happens when, the first revolt breaks out 70 years after Herod's death in the year 66 CE. And what happens at that time is that bands of Jewish rebels, I'm going to call them rebels, but some of these were really terrorist groups, right? Go down to
Zealots.
Well, no, actually, not at Masada, at least.
Fine.
So right. Good. So bands of Jewish rebels go down, and not all of them were the same groups either, right? Because there was a whole mixture of different groups at that point. It's sort of like today you have, Hamas and Hezbollah and, whatever. I mean, you have all these different, right? And now we're looking at this, 2,000 years in retrospect and trying to get accurate information from pretty much one source who sometimes presents conflicting or confusing information that's certainly anyway incomplete. So that's all got to be borne in mind. But at any rate, bands of Jewish rebels, when the revolt broke out, went down and took over some of Herod's old fortified palaces and pretty much held out on top of them for the duration of the revolt, which then lasts officially for 4 years until the year 70 CE, when the Romans take Jerusalem and destroy the Second Temple. And that's, officially the end of the revolt. So during the course of the revolt, then we have these bands of rebels, and one group goes down to Masada, and they were led by a guy named Menachem. According to Josephus's account, already at the beginning of the revolt, they go down to Masada and they sort of take over the mountain. There's no indication of how they did that. There must have been a Roman garrison there, but presumably it wasn't a particularly big garrison. Anyway, so these rebels take it over and they basically loot the storerooms that Herod had on top of Masada, which included military equipment and stuff like that, right? They basically loot it. This guy Menachem is eliminated from the picture not too long afterwards. He apparently was a very cruel person and did some really bad stuff. But eventually, it's a cousin of his whose name is Elazar ben Yattir, who becomes the leader who eventually makes his way to Masada and becomes the leader of the Jewish rebels occupying the top of Masada right up until the fall of the mountain. And that guy, Elazar ben Yattir, was a member of a Jewish terrorist group. And here I am, I'm deliberately using the word terrorist, called the Sicarii. The Sicarii were, the word Sicarii comes from the Latin word sica, which means dagger. So these were daggermen, if you want to put it into English. And they were known by that name because the way that they operated was to circulate in crowded urban contexts. So if you can imagine like the Temple Mount, where you have like thousands of Jewish pilgrims congregating for festivals or whatever. So they would circulate in these crowded urban contexts. And when there was somebody who they wanted to assassinate, they had a dagger, which they would hide under their robes. They would pull it out. They would stab the person in the back, put it back under their robes, and then run away. And as the person who was stabbed fell to the ground and there was all this chaos, they would disappear into the crowds, right? So they were literally urban terrorists. And they assassinated, their opponents, it wasn't like they were always fighting the Romans. A lot of their opponents were Jews. And, throughout the revolt with different groups, and this isn't this particular group with Elazar ben Yattir, but throughout the revolt, there were different groups that committed atrocities against other Jews, including one particular massacre at En Gedi where 700 of the villagers supposedly were massacred during the holiday of Passover by one of these groups, right? So there were a lot of these atrocities that went on during the revolt. Josephus records all sorts of horrible things that went on during the siege of Jerusalem. And so basically, by the time we get to the end of the revolt in 70, the official end, what happens is that this band led by Elazar ben Yattir is on top of Masada, right? And so this is the Sicarii. Now, you asked about Zealots. So there is one. So Josephus actually pretty consistently refers to the group on top of Masada led by Elazar ben Yattir as Sicarii, except for one time when he refers to them as Zealots. And this has led to a lot of discussion among scholars about, why, because the Zealots were a different group. They were not the same group, they were a different group. And what's interesting, so I would say that pretty much all scholars agree that they were not Zealots, they were Sicarii. For whatever reasons, Josephus that one time uses the word Zealots, but pretty much all scholars agree they were not Zealots, they were Sicarii. But where it gets complicated is that then when Yiga el-Yadin, who I'm sure you want to talk about, when he excavates the top of Masada and publishes his book, his popular book on Masada, he consistently refers to them as Zealots, not as Sicarii. And the question is why? Because Yadin knew the difference. He knew that they weren't Zealots. He knew that they were Sicarii. So it's not exactly clear why Yadin used that term, and that's created a lot of confusion because now, people go to Masada and they talk about the Zealots, when in fact they were Sicarii. There's an excellent book on the archaeology of Masada that was published, I think about in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, 2008, by Amnon Bentor, who's a very senior archaeologist now at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Institute of Archaeology, who in the 1960s was a graduate student in the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University and worked as an area supervisor on the dig with Yadin. So he speculates that Yadin chose to use the term Zealots and not Sicarii because Sicarii had a very negative connotation, particularly because at the time, Yadin, was kind of growing up and becoming active in, in Israeli, well, it wasn't even Israel yet, but anyway, before the establishment of the state of Israel, there was a group called Brita Biryonim, which was diametrically opposed to Yadin's, the Haganah, which Yadin was a part of. And this was kind of like the strongman alliance or something, who sort of saw themselves as like the Sicarii, who saw it as legitimate to assassinate opponents who were Jewish. And so, Bentor speculates that, Yadin wanted to distance the group of Masada and himself and the Haganah, he had this whole thing. And so he uses the term Zealots, which again, Josephus uses just once, to describe the rebels on top of Masada instead of Sicarii. So, anyway, that's kind of, it's a little bit complicated for the general public, but because even among scholars, there's no agreement. I mean, there are scholars who even think that Zealots didn't exist, that, maybe these groups didn't even exist, especially like the Zealots. Somehow it's just some sort of a scare word. That's how, Steve Mason puts it. So there's all sorts of disagreement, even among scholars. And again, it's because the nature of our sources, we're looking back 2,000 years. Anyway.